Today's topic will be on the expansion and imperialism of America from the years 1890 to 1909. After the Spanish-American War, the Filipinos expected to be granted freedom, like the Cubans. However, they were excluded from the treaty and the Philippines was occupied by American troops. In early 1899, an uprising against the Americans was led by Emilio Aguinaldo and his followers. The United States sent more than 100,000 troops to the Philippines in response. Filipino rebels inflicted guerrilla warfare on the Americans, but the latter responded with as intense methods. They no longer saw the Filipinos as innocent victims of the Spanish, but instead as their enemy. The army began to use torture methods, such as the water cure, which entailed forcing water down one's throat until they revealed information, and opened concentration camps that were cruel enough to rival the ones in Cuba. Finally, in 1901, America was able to infiltrate a guerrilla camp and capture Aguinaldo, leading to the end of the rebellion. However, the fighting continued for many more months and killed around 4,000 Americans and 200,000 Filipinos. Future President Taft developed an attachment to the Philippines and called the people his little brown brothers when he became their governor in 1901. Americanization of the islands then began with the building of infrastructure, schools, public health, and trade ties. However, Filipinos viewed this benevolence with disdain because they only wanted their own freedom, finally receiving it in 1946. Meanwhile, many Filipinos had immigrated to the United States. China, having been defeated by Japan in 1895, was taken over by Russia and Germany and lost the Manchu government. Churches began to worry about their missionaries, and merchants didn't want the Europeans to monopolize Chinese markets. Meanwhile, Americans became alarmed at the development. They urged for Secretary of State John Hay to do something. In summer 1899, Hay sent a letter called the Open Door Note to Europeans and asked them to respect certain Chinese rights and practice fair competition in trading with China. However, he did not inform the Chinese about this. Despite most foreign powers eventually agreeing to it, China did not wish to be used as a doorstep by foreigners. The Boxer Rebellion erupted, in which a super-patriotic group called the Boxers killed hundreds of foreigners and Chinese Christians and sieged the diplomatic community in Beijing. Several thousand soldiers from allied nations, including the United States, arrived to stop the rebellion in time. The invading countries demanded $333 million from China as an indemnity, with America having a share of $24.5 million. Knowing that this was more than enough to pay for damages, the United States decided to use about $18 million for the education of select Chinese students to America. Hay also sent another paper in 1900 that reiterated the open door, and that it would include both the commercial and territorial integrity of China. It made America responsible for regulating the treaty with all nations, and may have prevented the partition of China. President McKinley was re-elected predictably because of having won a war, accumulated new land, and kept the gold standard in his previous term. Theodore Roosevelt was also popular for the vice presidency because of his influence in the Cuban campaign. He had been elected governor of New York, but because the local politicians found him too headstrong, they decided to bring him to the vice presidency. Roosevelt was easily nominated for the vice presidency in the Republican Party. On the other hand, William Bryan was nominated in the Democratic Party and claimed that the Republicans preached imperialism, especially for millions of Filipinos. McKinley won by 292 electoral votes to 155. McKinley was assassinated in 1901 after only 6 months of the term, making Roosevelt the President of the United States. Roosevelt grew up in a well-off family and graduated from Harvard. He was a ranch owner for many years in the West before pursuing his political career, in which he was quite popular. He always showed great enthusiasm when talking or meeting with civilians, and supported shows of strength, not pacifism. Military and naval preparedness were both two of his top goals for the presidency. Roosevelt had a loud personality and was extremely social. Even more, he believed that the president should be the head of the government, in a loose interpretation of the Constitution, and that checks and balances was not necessary. The issue of building a waterway through the Central American Isthmus arose in order to increase naval mobility and better protect Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and the Philippines. The Clayton-Bulwer Treaty with Britain in 1850 prevented the United States from controlling any Isthmian route, but because of Britain's war in South Africa, they yielded. The Hay-Pauntsville Treaty of 1901 gave America the right to build the canal. There were disagreements over where the canal should be built. Many American experts preferred through Nicaragua, but the French Canal Company wanted to dig through Panama. Suddenly, the company's holding price fell from $109 million to $40 million. After Congress decided on the Panama route, it was time for the Colombian government to agree. However, they did not accept the initial offer of $10 million and an annual payment of $250,000 for a 6-mile route through Panama. On the other hand, the people of Panama wanted the canal to be built because they believed prosperity and freedom would follow. The French Canal Company also did not want to lose their $40 million, so they coordinated an uprising with Panama in 1903. The U.S. prevented Colombia from crossing the isthmus to stop the rebels. Immediately after, Bunau Varilla, the head of the company and now the Panamanian minister, signed the Hay-Bunau Varilla Treaty for $40 million, but for 10 miles of canal. Despite Roosevelt's minimal involvement in the Panama Uprising, Colombia believed that he had some part in it. This assumption made American and Latin American relations go downhill. Construction of the canal began in 1904, but took time because of labor problems, landslides, and tropical diseases. However, it was finished in 1914, right on the brink of World War I. Roosevelt got further tangled up in Latin American affairs because of the latter's relationship with European powers. Both Venezuela and the Dominican Republic were in debt to European creditors to the point where Germany had invaded Venezuela. Roosevelt feared that once Europe set foot in Latin America, they would not leave and be in violation of the Monroe Doctrine. In response to this thought, he declared a policy of preventative intervention, or the Roosevelt Corollary, in 1905. It entailed that if countries got into more financial trouble, the United States would intervene and pay it off. The Roosevelt Corollary, which rewrote the Monroe Doctrine, was used to justify multiple marine and naval landings in Latin America. To those presiding there, it seemed that instead of rescuing them, America was suppressing them. Once again, Cuba got involved in 1906 when the Cuban president asked for intervention in a rebellion. Even though they were pulled out in 1909, it showed America's increasing presence in Latin America. In 1904, Russia wanted to maintain trade relations with China, specifically in Port Arthur. Japan saw Russia's ties with China and Korea as a strategic hit to relations with itself. The Japanese inflicted attacks upon the Russians at Port Arthur and continued the attacks, but they soon ran out of soldiers and money. In secrecy, they asked Roosevelt to negotiate peace between the nations. Roosevelt was pleased with helping, especially because Russia's Tsarist powers could counter against Japan's growing existence in the world. However, neither party was left satisfied, as Japan could not ask for indemnities and Russia had to evacuate Sakhalin Island, but was allowed to have control over Korea. For having dealt with this and other peace-related problems internationally, Roosevelt received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1906. Despite this, relationships with Russia and Japan soured. Russia felt that America lost them a military victory, and Japan thought the United States cheated them out of receiving just compensation. Soon, Japan and America became rivals in Asia because of the growing power of the two. The Russo-Japanese War ended badly for Japan and caused taxes and restlessness to rise. As a result, many Japanese immigrants came to the American Pacific coast. White residents felt that they would drown in Asian Sea, despite the small number of immigrants. After the San Francisco earthquake in 1906, the school board ordered the segregation of Chinese, Japanese, and Korean students in a special school, so that there would be more room for white students. An international crisis broke out, since the Japanese felt that this was discrimination towards their children, and war talks started because of California. To further prevent conflict, Roosevelt invited the school board to the White House and finally solved the issue. The gentleman's agreement said that California had to repeal the school order, but Japan also had to stop labor immigration to the American mainland by withholding passports. To show that the United States wasn't afraid of Japan, Roosevelt had a voyage of battleships stopping in Latin America, Hawaii, New Zealand, Australia, and Japan. When it arrived in Japan, it received a very large and warm welcome. The two nations signed the Root-Takahira Agreement, in which they both agreed to respect each other's territorial possessions in the Pacific and also to maintain the open door note in China. For the time being, this would calm tensions between America and the rising power that was Japan.